Toussaint is a compact bijou within the empire of Nilfgaard, a gorgeous, breathtaking region drawing nearly a one-to-one parallel from something out of a fairy tale book. Valleys surrounded by a mountainous region is peppered with multiple eye-catching landmarks, such as the Regal Guardian, the booming capital of Beauclair, the enduring reminder of nobility's might, the imposing gargantuan Mount Gorgon, a beautiful, forsaken, old elven amphitheater that's seen better days just looming across the lake that now lies haunted, a forgotten relic of a forgotten time. Ever sprawling orchards and vineyards pumping life into the region, literally the beating heart of the culture, the lifeblood of the duchy. Each landmark holds its own, each inspiring awe, promoting Blood and Wine's natural strength, its natural draw, world exploration. The lands, more specifically the dirt, have hit the jackpot, so to speak, as these volcanic soils instill distinctive complexities within the grapes grown here, imbuing these literal fruits of labor with a multiplex of flavor profiles, perfect for any sommelier, etching its mark and putting Toussaint wineries, well, wines, on the map. Wine being the cultural lubrication of the duchy, it infects all aspects of life here, being the essence of Toussaint. A fairy tale reminiscent aura of these lands exudes a undeniable beauty. Although inviting, like any other region, the beauty is often contrasted against the typical malaise of the human experience, ranging from a vast multitude of inequities from societal, economical, and personal injustices, all the same as anywhere else. Being picture perfect doesn't mean perfection, of course, as naturally, nothing is perfect, right? Life, of course, holds no punches at times, falling under the umbrella of where there's love, of course, you better believe there's hate. Where there's light, there's darkness. You know, the generic tropes, the generic cliches. Nevertheless, these day-to-day expressions masquerading as complexities highlight the irony of life, dishing out the one aspect everyone will face, some more than others, sure. Yet trials and tribulations can cast aspersions on all of us, optimistically unifying a sense of empathy within the human spirit, really showing that, at the very least, we're not alone in the game of life. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of these dualities in the beautiful, gorgeous land of Toussaint, emphasizing no matter how beautiful something is on the surface, we all go through some stuff, right? Everyone's got skeletons in their closet. This is the dualities. This is the rich dichotomy of Toussaint.
Fascinating story. Any chance you're nearing the end?
Visiting Toussaint for the first time ambushes you with a wave of strong cultural shock. Going from the war-ravaged, gloomy, bog-ridden Velen to a relatively out-of-sight vassal that hasn't been stricken with the atrocities of war, contrasts Velen's gloom versus the duchy's boom. It's vibrant, oversaturated, at times even blinding hues of colors, again adding to the cultural shell shock of these lands. A bizarre conundrum, since Velen's backdrop fits to a T in terms of tackling overtly grim subject matter. I feel like overall the normalcy of Velen is hard to pinpoint with precise certainty. But it's dark, you know, and that is very much on the nose. It's hard to pinpoint because the war taking its toll on day-to-day life during the game really does kind of muddy the waters, but has always more or less, at least for me, felt like culturally Velen is a bit behind. It has the small town effect, how do I put it, heavily steeped in the stages of uncertainty within their civilization. The whole precipice of this video isn't at all in exploring the outlandishness of people of all cultures, of all castes having issues. It's more emphasizing how CD Projekt Red went about in doing it. Various mediums, when crafting their mode of storytelling, attempt in tackling this melancholy duality of beauty versus ugliness. A fabricated, terrible example right off the top of my dome, a movie will show something like a picturesque beach with flowing beautiful white sand, the crashing of the waves, the coconut tree gently swaying, animated by the slight breeze, the scorching sun perched atop, highlighting all of this splendor. Then it'll pan out, an oil spill on that beach, the oil polluting, seeping into the sand, turning it black, showing how humanity has literally again muddied the waters through human expansion, through human greed. It's brash, very on the nose, very not so subtle, conveying the message of good and evil in a simplistic yet smug, pseudo-intellectual attempt at complexity. It's trying to show this duality through smarmy antithesis, so to speak. People, more often than not without even realizing it, seek out simplicities subconsciously. Good versus evil is a very common trope, yet in my opinion, it's a very boring trope, but it of course has its time and place. It has its merit, and frankly, it just works in storytelling.
All of this just works.
But reality, oftentimes, is anything but simplistic. There's almost always nuances in life, two sides to the story, the other side of a coin. There's almost always gray areas regardless of the utmost. The Witcher 3 being more mature-oriented in general in terms of subject matter is why it's personally one of my favorite fantasy games of all time. Fantasy a lot of times gets pigeonholed, usually for a very young audience, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. I just feel like we often miss out on more realistic themes within this genre, shying away from tackling more complex, darker realities of the real world that very young people, hopefully, aren't even aware of, and don't need to be. The Witcher universe, however, is very nuanced. I mean, the Witchers themselves are literally the neutral alignment within the story structure, allowing stuff to kind of just happen, allowing the world and the politics of said world to be viewed through the lens of the player's unbiased eyes, with Geralt grunting out a spiteful, gravelly, sarcastic word here and there. CD Projekt Red really did capitalize on this when laying the blueprint, when crafting the base game, keeping to this framework when constructing Blood and Wine. Velen's populace are rugged, rough, and even at times kind of like, I don't know, borderline xenophobic vibe that I can't always quite put my finger on. They're just very paranoid, suspicious, cautious, and for good reason, which oftentimes has them coming across as vulgar or even downright discriminatory towards Witchers, parroting their hatred and disdain for anything that's different than them.
Die! Be gone!
You can't really blame them. I mean, they really do face a lot of monsters on the day-to-day, being everyday threats to these Nordlings' existence. Of course, in Velen, you'll get the occasional gratitude when slaying some beast of burden, but this distrustful, suspicious, understandable disposition of Velen remains a solid constant byproduct. This is antagonistic towards Toussaint's culture, of course, and how these inhabitants of the duchy perceive the world, falling more in line with even Skellige, as weird as that sounds. Although it's definitely not a one-to-one, the southerners of Toussaint have a lot of similarities and overlapping kind of mentality when it comes to Skellige's looting and plundering culture. Yet in Toussaint, it's not really looting and plundering, it's more based off valor, which is one of the tenets of the 5 chivalric virtues of the Knights Errant. These 5 tenets consisting of honor, compassion, valor, wisdom, and generosity, with valor being kind of the fuel for this mentality in Toussaint. There's just a sense of do-it-yourself for the glory here that mimics the spirit of Skellige in ways, a sort of cultural overlap. A traditionally masculine worldview, maybe immature depending on your opinion, that you just don't really simply see in the people of Velen. The Nordlings in Velen, as hardy as they are, more or less have to be backed into a corner and showing their fangs, for the most part, if that makes any sense. Without going into some crazy lore dive, the people living in the duchy are still human. They're still Nordlings after all, as this land is still in fact owned by Nilfgaard. They are, however, vastly distinct in culture, with Toussaint referring to themselves as Southerners, not no dang Northerners. Sounds familiar, right? The people of the duchy often cherish a more pragmatic approach philosophy when enduring the passage of time, having no real set belief structures within the culture for the most part that I'm aware of. They don't even really have an organized, mainstream, structured religion, or even a lot of times, independent religious views on a personal level. They value art, wine, and basically just chillaxing, not taking anything too seriously, preferring to live the good life over anything else. Of course, this is in opposition from a religious perspective with Velen's Church of the Eternal Fire. Independent communities of Nordlings in Velen also have their own belief systems, usually very rural communities, believing in sort of a druidism, a sense of polytheistic paganism to some degree, worshipping the divinity of nature, which in a lot of ways of course mirrors the druids' beliefs of Skellige. Cultural identity diverging quite a lot, however doesn't take away the human element of overlapping similarities. People will be people. They have a pride for their general governance, they're hardworking, they're gritty, and they have determination. These are just some fast examples off the top of my head that always seem to cross this cultural divide. All of these differences between these cultures, all the contrasting elements that make them stand out on their own, one of my favorite aspects of the obvious dichotomy players will experience when separating Toussaint from the rest, setting this cultural tone of this fairy tale land. Being, of course, just the fun premise of this video with no real tangible rhyme or reason. This is a fluff piece. For me to love on Toussaint a bit more, to love on the people and culture. Heroes who were once heralded in the past could easily be seen as villains in the present. A stupid pseudo-intellectual quote I wrote when I was like 12 years old, like 100 years ago, way back in the day. Yeah! It's straight to the point. It's digestible on its face value. Believe it or not, morality can be ever-changing, dependent on a magnitude of factors. This so-called moral compass has some universal objective truths, sure. I mean, stuff like murder is bad, hurting innocent people is bad, lying maliciously is bad, abusing animals and kids is evil. Just straight up stuff that's like, yeah, that's terrible. That is literal evil. It's bad, Mkai. The list goes on and on with these objective truths. This compass, however, is based on a surplus of complexities that I can't possibly mull over all of them because I'm not a psychologist and I am very incompetent in that regard. But in a nutshell, people really do tend to be more or less a byproduct of their environment. Sometimes even victims of their own environment. Some more than others, some overcome, some sink. And whether this happens subconsciously, consciously, or even willingly, or a combination of all these factors on an individual basis, always sets the stage for molding their outlook on life to some varying degree. The whole point of this stupid rant is for the simple fact, no culture has ever, or likely will ever, skirt the criminal underbelly of human nature. A criminal element will always be a constant in any culture, regardless of how prosperous, regardless of some, I don't know, hypothetical utopia in the future. People have free will in deciding for oneself. And of course that free will can be distorted through manipulation, addiction, violence, mental illness, desperation, greed, and so on. With contrary to these facts taking a monumental shift of what we currently know about the universe and changing this reality. Toussaint, of course, is no different. Bandits run rampant, just as they do in Velen and Skellige, and just as they do in, well, pretty much every fantasy game. With Toussaint really does have a really nasty bandit problem. I mean, they even have names, for God's sake. On a serious note, however, in Blood and Wine, you'll discover at the ducal Camerlingo offices in Beauclair's Knight's dormant city square, they're outsourcing bounty hunting. Outsourcing to pretty much anyone that's up for the task. Highlighting again the general open-mindedness of the people. If you're capable, go for it. They only really care about the end result. Harkens back to their culture being, I don't know, a bit more progressive, for a lack of better words. This bounty hunting tasks you in getting rid of some ragtag motley crew types of gangs leaders. Banditry in Toussaint is intriguing to me because of the valorous virtues, perpetuated as being a proud heart of the culture, standing within the norms of even everyday civilians that aren't knights, giving them something to aspire to. They really do hold merit within the common folk. And knights in a lot of ways are the commoner's heroes, so to speak, at least historically. And these valorous creeds are something that really do bleed into the civilian population's way of thinking. You constantly see young kids looking up to knights, wanting to be knights. Yet there really is a tone of erosion for those inspirations from the knightly virtues. It really is currently eroding in a lot of communities, really reinforcing this obvious schism between the knights errant's values, reinforcing the deepening distrust of not only the knights in general that protect the lands, but of course of the very institutions that lay at the core foundation of their society. This public distrust is a subtle wedge within the culture here, yet it's not unseen. Realistic outcome of the Knights' orders becoming corrupt, complacent, lazy, and self-serving, not putting their money where their mouth is and upholding their own values, turning them hypocritical in the eyes of the people. And of course, this is a very real phenomena in the RL through something like police brutality, corruption, overstepping means, which just sows the seeds of distrust within their own communities they're supposed to protect in the first place. I mean, this is even lamented in Blood and Wine's main quest line, with the knights getting offed by Dettlaff, the very reason for you even coming here in the first place. With Sienna manipulating the hot-headed ancient vampire, the beast of Beauclair. All of these knights treated Sienna, well, not great putting it lightly, while exiling her because she had the real or not debatable curse of the Black Sun. This hypocrisy within the knight's virtues, this general rot of these merits, displays a lot of form of regression within Toussaint society as you see it in the game. A festering distrust has a lot of common folk looking at the once beloved, esteemed knights as nothing more than mere thugs. What's so hypnotic regarding the banditry here, it's very obvious there's quite a lot of them, forming pseudo-paramilitary groups known as Hanses. And it's easy to see these bandits are pretty organized, much more condensed, and serve much more of a threat for the local law enforcement. So naturally, mingling between these two factions of power, criminals and enforcers, is unfortunately very realistic. Just as in the real world, as these so-called Hans groups hold sway over the lands in some capacity through sheer numbers and force alone. This is extremely transparent when you directly examine the nature of the bandits here, versus the bandits in say Velen or Skellige. In those lands they are spread very thin, kind of like isolated sub-pockets of subgroups of petty cutthroats for the most part. There's little to no organization, comprising much smaller bands. Many are in the throes of survivalism, driven by desperation through famine, the ongoing instability of war, plagues, and the collapse of whatever economy they thrived on beforehand. Bandits, however, in the duchy also live a much higher quality of life. They aren't driven by sheer hopelessness. Although relatively, I'm sure desperation or perceived desperation remain a personal driving factor, especially financially. How bandits are perceived here was obviously taken into account with how other forms of societal issues overlap in how they affect the populace here, as crime is somewhat correlated to some level with poverty.
Help! Save me! I'm dying of poverty.
And poverty in Toussaint is again relative poverty. There's people suffering here, but they get their basic needs met. There's consistency and care taken here between these two correlations, which is an obvious attention to detail that should be commended by CD Projekt Red. The decomposition of public trust can be catastrophic for communities if left unchecked. a societal tumor that grows rapidly cancerous, oftentimes this damage becoming irreversible. It's a domino effect of corruption, abuse of power, all adding fuel to the fire, stoking the flames more and more.
Time for a little drinky poo. Cheers, genitals.
Alcohol playing a huge role in crime in RRL, but here of course the spotlight is in domestic violence. And alcohol plays a huge part in that as well too. Culturally, where heavy drinking is socially accepted, normalized, or even encouraged, which is a lot of countries to be fair, drinking has obvious detrimental effects on society by and large, yet is often shrugged off as nothing more than a fun night out. I mean, look at tons of movies like The Hangover, right? When you look into the statistics of the real world regarding domestic violence, alcohol in some studies have been involved in something like 92% of cases, being linked directly to alcohol as a primary factor. Drinking is extremely addictive for some people, causing a degenerative effect if people, get hooked on it. The crippling effects of alcoholism. Places that have huge drinking problems in the real world also reflect this. Sometimes cultural acceptance with alcohol, in my opinion, it can be a bit much. It's far too normalized at times. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not a prude, I'm not a prohibitionist or anything like that. I realize you can drink moderately, but some people can't. And I feel like avid drinkers really do downplay the destructive nature it can have on some people who do have that propensity towards addiction. And some people are just more prone and vulnerable in succumbing to it. I don't know. I always try to have an empathetic view towards people suffering anything, and addiction is another one of those that kind of falls under the umbrella of mental health. And I think having empathy is very important for society as a whole. There's definitely a lot of remarks around that has misogynistic tones, despite the duchy being, led by a woman and being progressive in that regard. Drinking being so ingrained in the society here, it's kind of like a brooding mirror of the ugly side of too much to drink. Another reality within this beautiful land, of course, is in the nature of the beast. In terms of that bag, bro. That bankroll, that guac.
More money? We've got to have money.
That puts you in the game of the societal hierarchy. Rich and poor, a tale as old as, well, I guess humanity. Toussaint has poverty, I know, crazy, right? Despite being a well-off vassal that stacks that paper like a rap video. The economy here is largely propped up through the wine trade. They be popping them bottles like Birdman. Produce staples of Toussaint outside of the obvious like grapes and olives are delicacies like honey, wild game, bread, even radishes amongst various other fruits of labor, typically dried and exported all around the lands. Overlooked staples outside of wine is lumber, employing sustainable forestry practices showing a higher fundamental cognizance of the cause and effect on their environment in the long term. Also overlooked is the export of slate. Although the mining of this metamorphic rock has recently slowed, it once was the bedrock, pun intended. The frickin' bee's knees of the economy here for quite a while, and exporting this versatile building block around for constructing settlements was the lifeblood of various communities, and to some extent even today in some communities, as seen at the Ardagio quarry. This land of love does well for itself financially. I mean, you can see this through the attitude, just the general vibes and how people treat you and each other. Yet of course, poverty oftentimes creeps in plain sight. Even though I'm not going to delve into the side quests of Blood and Wine, you also see this kind of dichotomy just between the rich and poor as well, in terms of just kind of how they act. Like, a lot of the quests you get from the hard class working people are, the vineyards, they want some monsters cleared, just general contract stuff that is interrupting their day-to-day, work. As where the rich people of Toussaint are basically bored and they're trying to create entertainment, for lack of a better word, for themselves. Poverty is something I always liked in video games when represented well, and I really do love how well they did this in this expansion pack. The way it's tackled in Toussaint is very deliberate from a world building standpoint. After all, there's levels to everything, layers and all, like onions. And poverty here, as I already mentioned when talking about the bandits, falls under the definition of what's called relative poverty. And sure, some individuals skirt the lines here, with some suffering more extremes than others based on individual circumstances, but the level of poverty never reaches the extremes you see in like Velen.
Help! Save me!
They got it really rough, and people be starving their asses off. Relative poverty is defined as you're at the very least meeting your basic necessities, your bare necessities. Most what are called first world countries have social safety nets for combating things like hunger, providing basic health care, and clean water. The bare minimums, right, that some of us take for granted every day. You can be poor nonetheless in these countries, and still suffering, by the way. I'm not taking that aspect away from poverty at all. Impoverished regions in games are so captivating, and The Witcher 3, despite being a fantasy game, leans into the coattails of realism at nearly all cylinders. You're a mutant monster slayer, there's magic, elves, there's freaking gnomes, well, halflings, all the hallmarks of high fantasy. Yet from a social, political, and economical factor, great attentiveness was exercised, all based in the roots of said realism. Much higher quality of life compared to like say Velen, which is of course staying consistent in how it's shown within the relative poverty as well. There's a one-to-one comparison between the bandits and the poor. In the heart of Toussaint, the mighty Beauclair remains the capital, with nobility living the high life in the upper district of Haughtyville, also known as the Upper Town, sat perched above with all the luxury overlooking the busy streets below, filled to the brim with the everyday hardworking class, growing calluses, bustling in the lower town known as San Sebastian's district. It's very easy to see right away that despite not living the high life here, like a lot of society, these people are vital moving parts of the economy, and a large residency here calls this district home, making a living running workshops, the local brothel, butcher shops, taverns, ship hands, and dockrights run the export trade of goods coming in and out of the port. The trade district, the hub, strictly speaking, the heart of not only Beauclair, but the whole of Toussaint itself. This district isn't fenced off either. The economy booming birthed a spontaneous eruption of residency here, with this community trickling down, spiraling from the top of the hill, snaking all the way to the bottom of the port keeping the pulse of the community going. If you came here first, for example, let's say it's your very first time basking in the beauty of Beauclair, without knowing the grandeur of Haughtyville, unaware of the opulence of the royal palace, you might think to yourself, this is a part of said rich fancy area. It really is just gorgeous, especially with this being the quote-unquote slums of the city. A fleeting but memorable moment that is experienced, well, I guess depending on your choices in Blood and Wine, is if you choose in lifting the curse of Marlene de Trastamara, shedding her whiteness, spotted whiteness. The whole point I'm bringing up here is she was cursed by ignoring a old tradition, a tradition of hospitality towards the less fortunate. It's highly insinuated our boy, none other than the big God, Master Mirror himself, posed as a beggar, bowl and spoon in hand at Marlene's doorstep, begging for some grub. This belief, although implied in being a tradition of old, with the passage of time affecting its relevance in the present, is anyone's guess. A mantra of hospitality, as the owner of a house must offer with open arms the needy, a comeuppance to a beggar. Marlene refusing ol' Mirror Man, he slapped her with a nasty curse. And we all know Gaunter is the definition of fuck around and find out. A compelling little tidbit exemplifying almsgiving within Toussaint traditions. People care, and that says a lot about the culture, a lot about the society, without really even having to say much at all. Altruism being ushered into the picture doesn't end here either. At the very end of the main quest in Blood and Wine, if you, the player so chooses, investigating a bit more alongside our boy Regis, if you dig a bit deeper into Sienna's motivations, while orchestrating the assassinations, galvanizing Detlef as her own weapon, her own personal animal puppet, yeah, Detlef is a sim. You're brought back to San Sebastian's district, where you can meet an unnamed man, simply known as the shelter owner, aiding the local populace with, get this, a shelter. However, you also see a pretty familiar social stigma that is called homism. Basically, typical negative stereotypes about people experiencing homelessness. You know, they're lazy, they're criminals, they're all drug addicts and alcoholics, or etc, 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 right? The locals of San Sebastian's kind of frown upon this guy for bringing the poor here, even threatening this lovely older gentleman, desperately urging him to shut down his philanthropic operation, thinking it brings in no do-gooders lounging around the neighborhood. Basically, a bunch of Karens. So of course, that side of humanity exists as well, unfortunately. It's all too common in the real world, but it does again add some seasoning of human realism. That is, of course, discrimination. Toussaint is a place like none other, yet remains a place like every other. A place I definitely wouldn't like living in personally, at least not as a permanent resident. My personal reasoning behind this, it would feel like living in a dream. Sure, you'd be enchanted by it for some time, lulled by the beauty for a bit, even seduced by it. The laid-back, nonchalant, cast your worries into the wind sensation of the culture would be pretty intoxicating, just like the wine that drives the culture in the first place. However, this hazy dreamscape would flip on its head, turning nightmare for me at some point. The sheer repetition of this blindingly colorful landscape, pompous yet humble, almost sarcastic banter, a wine-fueled yet semi-uppity culture would drive me into insanity through, I don't know, like the Groundhog's Day effect. Perhaps I'm being a bit harsh, but something about Toussaint, if real, would be a vacay, not a mainstay for me. Different strokes for different folks though. From a game design standpoint, these mythical lands remain undisputably one of my favorite settings in any video game that I've personally ever played. Experiencing it for the first time should be sincerely savored, never be taken for granted. It's something that should be cherished. The vibrant attitudes of the people, cheese and wine, sprawling, rolling vineyards, snowy peaked mountaintops, old elven ruins of a bygone generation, the chivalrous pursuit for glory and proving one's worth, honorable knights, the emphasis on nobility and royal blood, leaning into well-established high fantasy tropes, executed tastefully. The core tenets, the strong foundation that made The Witcher 3's base game so sturdy, withstands any storm of criticism regarding Blood and Wine as well. A fantastic land worth exploring, an expansion of not only a new story, but character builds themselves through the mutagens. Amazing quests with branching paths, a new cast of colorful characters, and a place to rest Geralt's head for once at Corvo Blanco. The world does interact and actually admires your deeds, just like the base game, stating things that are locally happening around their homeland. Life has a lot of dualities, where there's young, there's old, peace, there's violence, luxury, there's poverty, but these dualities, regardless of the society, are just a fact of life. People will always be people at the end of the day. Sure, the scenery might change, the culture might change, the faces might change, the politics might change, but you can't ever really escape the human condition. The seedier side of Toussaint always stood out like a sore, yet very subtle, discreet thumb. There isn't very much fantasy games, or even just games in general, that do this juxtaposition with any real tact. The splendor and glory of it all descends into tragedy as you dig a bit deeper beneath the surface, remaining a constant hallmark here. Games I feel that do this exceptionally well often have an out, so to speak, a strong foundation. For example, games like Fallout, where you have this constant undertone of what once was, reflection of our real-world society, now lie crumbled, a persistent yet staunch reminder of what could be in our future. If we descend into the madness, the seeing of red rage, that is a nuclear holocaust. It's depressingly easy to imagine humanity going to hell in a handbasket, but there's a natural morbid curiosity that sets the tone organically within Fallout. Yet this grounding contrast is very difficult to replicate within any medium, frankly, and when executed amply, it does feel like not only lightning in a bottle, but a thunderstorm in a bottle. In all fairness as well, The Witcher dittos the essence of Fallout in terms of boasting a very strong IP in itself. And staying briefly on the topic of Bethesda games real quick, even though recently they've been swinging a lot of strikes within the gaming industry, but their role-playing games of the past, as much as people rightfully criticize how they haven't improved a lot on the quote-unquote Bethesda Scrolls-like formula, what I don't hear a lot of people talk about in terms of their game design is that being not expanding upon the NPCs. NPCs in Bethesda games are such an underrated, strong element within the world building. They're kind of like, I don't know, my high school sweetheart, one of my first loves in terms of appreciating the actual characters in video games. They have almost a Sims-like effect if I had to put it into words. They have schedules, routines, relationships, there's lore, they even chit-chat, and you can just kind of stand back and listen to them. People just talk to each other that, adds a little more story to them. It adds a little bit more flavor to places like Diamond City, Riften, Novak, and Megaton, amongst various others. It just breathes life into the world. Although The Witcher 3, in my opinion, never quite reaches this level of NPC individualism within, just the generic NPCs you encounter. It lacks that, insect in a bottle like effect that Bethesda NPCs have, but it is very easy to take the people of The Witcher 3 for granted. And as time has passed and I came back to the game, they really do interact with your choices in the world. They quip interesting dialogue that does correlate with where you are in your adventures while controlling Geralt. The world and your choices come into effect. They matter. And although they do feel less like an individual than per se something like, Fallout New Vegas or Skyrim or something, they add a lot of variety to the world. And the sheer number of them all going about their day-to-day lives is something Bethesda still currently fails at doing. They've never really been able to compete with CD Projekt Red in that regard, in more modern times at least, from a sheer scale perspective. With The Witcher 3 cities genuinely feeling like fully fledged, realistic hubs within a fictional universe. It serves its purpose in that strength though, even though most random civilians in The Witcher 3 are just that, a random civilian. High fantasy games have countless hurdles in leaping over when tackling mature subject matter, on top of the monstrosity of just developing a large open world sandbox game. You have enemy, item, and level scaling, multiple pathways in the quest design, world building in terms of making the culture and people around you feel authentic, dialogue, all that on top of just having a competent gameplay loop to keep the player chasing the carrot on the end of the stick that is player engagement. All of this is a gargantuan task at hand for any developer, period. CD Projekt Red really did execute their vision for Toussaint, making it stand out in its own merits. The bandits, poverty, and culture remains grounded within their interrelation from one another. The vibrant, bombastically brash, borderline yet not completely pompous attitudes, yet they come off genuine. They don't come off smug, at least not completely. They're carefree yet serious tonal inflection that defines their worldview. The embrace, the love, and pride of their land, of their culture, of their wine, of their food, their customs, just their way of life, oozes so much personality in all corners of the duchy. It all accumulates to a veneer of euphoria. A flash of brightness on the surface, diluted with darkness at its very core, shifting the tone from giddy to melancholy, making everything feel at the very end bittersweet. Blood and Wine really kind of ran with the adage of taking heaping tablespoons of inspiration from something like old childhood folktales, where on the surface they seem innocent, they seem benign, yet at its core has a pretty grim message, a cautionary tale that fits the peril of the world. And I feel like that is Toussaint in a lot of ways. That's kind of how they ran with it, at least the vibe of it. The dichotomy of these lands reflect that here, they really do. With this rich, well-off vassal remaining steadfast in my mind, long after I put down my controller. These fairy-tale-esque lands of Toussaint, they just hit it out of the park. It really does make you want to, go explore that cave and wanting to learn more and more about the people, about the culture, just an overall sense of yearning, a game that grips you in, a sense of what's around the corner, a sense of limitless possibilities. The difference between a game you can sink 1 hour into or a game you can sink 100 and plus into has for me always been a cornerstone of what separates the wheat from the chaff. A bad game, a great game, or a masterpiece. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider a comment, a like, a sub, all of that good stuff. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.